such an alien experience still, even though I've been to a few events. It always feels like a certain frisson, like we're going to a birthday party or a wedding or a graduation or something like that. So we're going to have a conversation, James and I, about various and sundry, the World Cup, the Yankees, things like that. That was supposed to be kind of a wry little, no we're not, but we'll all get into the flow gradually. And then we'll take some questions, and then we'll be done. So my name is Zachary Karabell. My bio is there, but James is the man of the hour, who I've just gotten to know a bit. And I will do a quick version of this for people who are online and not have the bio in front of them. James Falk has been a senior executive of the Hong Kong Exchange and Clearing from 2012 to 2021, which is one of the major financial clearinghouses, exchanges, trading. He had a role in a number of landmark financial market initiatives, including the launch of the Shanghai Hong Kong Stock Connect program, the Bond Connect program, and the Hong Kong markets listing reform. Prior to that, he worked as an investment banker in Europe and in Asia. He's written and spoken extensively about market structure and the intersection between geopolitics and international finance, and has served on a number of financial industry bodies, including Ireland for Finance Industries Advisory Committee, the Executive Board of the International Securities Service Association, and the Financial Services Advisory Committee of the Hong Kong Trade and Development Council, and is a member of the Advisory Board of Hex Trust. So that is James's bio. And we are here also talking about your recent book, which I should have had a copy of to raise to people, which is about Sino-Chinese financial integration and issues and the challenges thereof. So I think on that, it's probably an opportune place to start. And maybe if you could give people a little bit of a thumbnail background about the financial integration or lack thereof that has wended its way in various stops and starts between the United States and Hong Kong, China, between the West and Hong Kong, China, because in the book you go back and give a history of this into the 19th century, and I'm not asking you to give a 19th century to the 21st century précis, but maybe a little bit of a thumbnail sketch of how these relations have evolved over the past decades.
Zachary, thank you for that very kind introduction. I spent almost 10 years of my life essentially at the heart of the capital markets opening of China to the world. And through that came to recognize that there were many parts of the financial system that were contributing to some of the tensions and conflicts that have built up between China and the United States. And my book's an attempt to explain the sources of those tensions in a hope that the two countries' leaders may find a way of resolving them. In Cantonese, we have this phrase, the chicken talking to the duck, which essentially means people talking at cross purposes. And through my work, where I had the good fortune of coming into close contact with a number of senior policymakers in China, Hong Kong, the United States, and around the world, I realized that there's quite a lot of chickens talking to ducks amongst the major actors in policy making around financial markets, and that it was necessary to help find a way of making sure they understood each other better and where each other were coming from.
It's funny, I have a deep envy both for Cantonese sayings and any cultural place where there are sort of aphorisms and metaphors built into the normal patois. In the United States, it's usually in the South where someone will say, "That boy's dumber than sawdust sitting on a log in a rainstorm," and people are just able to say these things as part of a sort of poetic, metaphorical aspect of analysis in a way that you just never do in the Northeast of the United States. So I like the chicken talking to the duck as a way of understanding these two things. So we talked earlier a little bit about if you just read the news, and gleaned what's going on today from the news about Hong Kong, you would essentially conclude that between the protests in 2019 and various both internal lockdowns and really shutting off from physical transit with much of the rest of the world since February or March of 2020, that Hong Kong is done, right? That the Hong Kong's position as an intermediary financial and commercial between China and Asia, between China and Europe, between China and the United States is done, that everybody has moved to Singapore, and that whatever was the special system that had been Hong Kong from until 1999 and then much until 2019 is a thing of the past. It is no longer that. So tell us if that very facile interpretation, which is pretty prevalent, I think, whether it's Bloomberg or the New York Times or anybody writing in any financial publication, is that a completely distorted assessment or a correct one?
There's no denying the fact that Hong Kong's been through a rough time, from the protests in 2019 to the imposition of the national security law in 2020 through to the recent COVID lockdown. When I left Hong Kong, we'd just been in pretty much 3 months of lockdown where the kids weren't in school, everyone was working from home, or the restaurants are shut. The news is pretty grim, but if you look at the facts and figures, notwithstanding all of these body blows that Hong Kong's taken, at least in the financial markets, which is its key industry, it saw record trading volumes in the share market last year. It was the second best year ever on record for derivatives trading volumes. And the Stock Connect programs between China and Hong Kong and the Bond Connect programs continue to see volumes grow. That speaks to the fact that Hong Kong is fairly unique. It is the venue of choice that international investors go through to get access to the mainland Chinese securities market. So as long as there continues to be financial interaction between China and the rest of the world, then I think Hong Kong will do just fine. If you look forward to once we come through out of these COVID restrictions, hopefully sooner rather than later, Hong Kong actually has a lot of key advantages in amongst the fiscal and other monetary stimulus measures that most countries have gone through to deal with the pandemic. Hong Kong finds itself in this envious position of still having no net debt at the public level. Hong Kong has savings, net savings of $500 billion. It's a small place, so that is over $70,000 for every man, woman, and child in Hong Kong. So as other places, other financial centers may see themselves having to raise taxes, Hong Kong actually should be in a very healthy position. Hong Kong is also, because of its dependence on financial markets, absolutely committed to the open and free flow of capital. When we see ultimately what the level of hangover is from monetary stimulus is in many different countries, we could well see a lot of other centers starting to enact the unthinkable, currency controls, capital controls, and so forth. Hong Kong is very unlikely to do this. And what's more, with one country, two systems, it inherently has one foot in both camps of China and the international markets. And so in that sense, so long as there's business being done between China and the rest of the world, I think that Hong Kong is very privileged. More recently also, you've seen with the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia post the Ukraine invasion, the main financial center that is considered to be a rival of Hong Kong in Asia, Singapore, has imposed, it's followed along with Western sanctions on Russia. When you think about China's capital markets internationalization and its own concerns about its financial security for Chinese investors investing outside of mainland China beyond Hong Kong, Singapore may have once been an option for them to go to. It is that no longer. So if you look at it from that perspective, Hong Kong is now the only game in town, although admittedly we in Hong Kong have an awful lot to do to regain the trust of the international business community, international investors, and regain the trust, frankly, also of the mainland Chinese, who've been slightly despairing at the social issues that Hong Kong's allowed to bubble up. But I don't think Hong Kong's days are ended just yet as a financial center.
Although, I mean, admittedly, in this, I think can segue into a discussion of sort of Sino-U.S. relations as it applies, particularly to financial markets. You know, the idea that Hong Kong becomes an even more desirable alternative for mainland Chinese capital because of the legitimate concern that some investors and institutions might have that if they invest through Singapore, they will be subject to U.S.-led sanctions on various Russian companies and activities. While that's an entirely understandable perspective from a mainland Chinese investor, it does play into the narrative of the United States is supporting a particular world order with particular mores, including, you know, non-invasion of sovereign territories. Whether or not the United States has or has not abided by its own mores is a whole other issue, and that Hong Kong becomes the financial market of choice for those who don't wish to abide by the same rules. I mean, how do you respond to that pushback? Because then, I mean, what you're saying is certainly true structurally, but there does come that pushback.
Look, I mean, that's fair pushback, but you made one point in your question there, which was that, you know, this is an international order. Well, let's break that down for a minute. No one is defending for 1 second Russia's aggression in the Ukraine. It's a terrible thing. It is absolutely awful, and it should stop immediately. But many different countries have a different point of view as to the path that led to the current tragedy. And when you look at the so-called international order imposing sanctions on Russia, well, actually, this is countries accounting for roughly, you know, between 10 and 15% of the world's population. China has very specific reasons for not going along with these sanctions. China is very dependent on Russia because it's been forced to diversify its sources of supply of food and energy to buy that across from the Siberian border from Russia. That's been forced on it by the fact that it is surrounded in its immediate coastal environs by the United States. And it is unfortunately not self-sufficient for either food or energy. This is a key security issue for China. On top of that, China shares a 2,600-mile border with Russia. Russia is critical for the security and stability of a number of Central Asian countries on China's western border. China cannot afford for Russia to be destabilized. It certainly doesn't want to get on the wrong side of the United States. It's very dependent on the dollar system for its trade and financial interaction with the rest of the world. So the Chinese are forced into walking a tightrope at this point in time. But in not following Western sanctions, China is not alone. India, Brazil, these major countries have chosen not to go along with this. And, you know, as much as, you know, when you read the English language, Anglo-Saxon press, you get a certain view of the world, I would encourage people to go and read and listen to what very balanced intellectuals in places like India, places like China are saying. There's two sides to this story. And in that, I would say that when it pertains to Hong Kong's role and allowing other countries to skirt sanctions, I'm also very wary of this. I'm also very wary of this weaponization of the financial commons that has been occurring. The dollar system grants the United States enormous power. And that is a power that increasingly it has been weaponizing against its strategic rivals. And whatever the morality around doing that, I would point out that in conventional warfare, there is an established principle of non-combatant immunity. No such rule exists in financial warfare. The first-order effects of Western financial sanctions on Russia has been a spike in the oil price and a run for the short term on the ruble. Think about the second-order effects. In Sri Lanka, you've subsequently seen violent protests break out, precipitated by fuel price inflation. Sri Lanka's got absolutely nothing to do with what's going on in Ukraine right now, but it has been sideswiped by these sanctions as well. Then think about the third-order effects, that the butterfly effects of the global financial system means that it is extremely unpredictable. And so you've got a whole load of countries across Asia, Latin America, who sell their commodities, who sell their labor to the rich, developed West. By selling that, they've accumulated a whole bunch of savings. The West has now frozen Russia's foreign exchange reserves. This is an unprecedented move. What are the consequences of that? If all those countries in Asia, in Latin America and so forth lose confidence that they will have access to their savings in the event of a rainy day, or if they happen to get on the wrong side of the US, are they still going to be willing to sell those goods and those services to the West in return for dollars? What impact, if they choose not to do that, will it have on inflation in the developed world? And what are the knock-on consequences on social stability here in the United States and in Western Europe? I think that there are many problems in the world, and I think that certainly that they need to be addressed. But don't be fooled for a minute that just because you're not rolling tanks across borders and you're pursuing other means of warfare through the financial system or through cyber means, that is necessarily going to avoid a calamity at some point. All it does is it simply is another step of ratcheting up of conflicts. What needs to be addressed is the fundamental root sources of those conflicts.
I have to say it was a really thought-provoking and quite passionate articulation of a view that is not widely expressed in domestic American audiences. One pushback would be there's a difference between freezing of foreign reserves and the weaponization of a dollar system, meaning the freezing of foreign reserves is more like a boycott or an imposition of a specific country. The use of the dollar as a coercive tool to force other countries to abide by domestic American or European policy, I think those are two different levels of behavior, because one is more, we're freezing U.S. denominated foreign reserves. The other is using an international system to coerce other countries to follow a policy line that they have no say over. And I would distinguish between those in terms of orders of the weaponization of the dollar and the sanction system, which is really was not done until the 90s in any particular way, and has accelerated remarkably over the past 15 years. I do think raises a lot of questions and may in fact create the seeds of undermining that system, because it incentivizes other countries, China in particular, to find ways to make sure that system does not impinge on their sovereign behavior, right? And I'd like to maybe talk a little bit about that, which is, had we been having this conversation 10 or 15 years ago, the expectation was widely that China would begin to liberalize its currency controls, either in baby steps or with some sort of sequence, that there'd be more RMB dollar exchange in some way that approximated a free-floating system, and in many ways that's been set back remarkably. I'd be interested to hear your perspective on that, if that's ever going to happen, or is a lot of this pushed China in the direction of, and Beijing in the direction of finding an alternate dollar system?
Well, first of all, to your point about that there being degrees of distinction between different forms of financial sanction, I agree with that. But if you take a step back and look at the grand scheme of things, certainly vis-a-vis China, it's a distinction without a difference. China today has a very rapidly aging population. And in order to ensure that that population generates savings that will keep themselves through, hopefully, what is a very long and healthy retirement, China needs to mobilize its capital in capital markets. Today, still, because of the underdeveloped domestic markets in China, the vast majority of China's savings sits in residential property. You've already seen that's a bubble market. They've been pushed into that for want of better alternatives. The second largest pool of China's savings is in bank deposits. There are $35 trillion of Chinese savings sitting in bank deposits in China. In order to defray the inevitable rise in social welfare spending by the Chinese government, they need to see those savers start to put that money to better use in financial markets. China's domestic equity markets and debt markets are very large, but they're not large enough to absorb anywhere near that amount of capital within a short space of time, not least without generating huge asset price bubbles. That means China needs to bring its money out into international capital markets. The problem for China today is that any Chinese investor investing outside of mainland China beyond Hong Kong finds him or herself entirely dependent on a Western-controlled financial infrastructure of payment networks, of international depositories, of global custodians. And Chinese policymakers have very simply looked at the means of affecting financial sanctions on Russia in the wake of 2014 and held up their hands and said, look, we cannot possibly put ourselves at that financial security risk. So we're in a stalemate, we're in a deadlock, because it's entirely in China's interest to bring that money out. It would entirely be in the West and the rest of the world's interest to get access to that capital. Think about all the infrastructure improvements that you could make here, the roads, the railways, the ports, the bridges that could be built and improved and upgraded if you were able to tap into what is the largest untapped capital pool in the world. Instead, because of the lack of secure means of doing so for China, China is stuck with having to invest internationally through its corporations. China's majority of its investment overseas takes place through Chinese corporations, quite a lot of them state-owned, through schemes like the Belt and Road Initiative. And the problem with that, as we've seen, is that when Chinese corporations go and invest in other countries, it inevitably brings up sensitivities about the level of Chinese government influence, the level of Chinese government control, the amount of technology transfer, the amount of jobs transfer that might entail. If you could have 1,000 Mrs. Wangs from Chongqing or Shanghai buying a few shares of Apple or Amazon, nobody's going to care. If you can find a means of giving China that financial security, you would improve the feeling of security for many countries receiving Chinese investment. And in turn, that would help de-escalate the types of frictions and tensions that we've seen building up between China and the West, and particularly America.
No, I mean, I totally agree on that. I mean, there was a period of time where, at least into 2017, you had more inklings of Chinese direct investment in the United States. Foxconn was going to build a factory in Wisconsin. There were more things on the table until CFIUS, which is the Treasury Department. It's the interagency, for those who don't, the interagency part of the U.S. government that vets all foreign purchases of U.S. companies for national security issues. But the mandate of that can go extraordinarily far. Like if you buy a apron factory that happens to be 3 miles from a different factory, that could be considered a national security risk. And there was a time, I suppose another pushback is there's a bit of mutually assured financial destruction embedded in the current system, in that, unlike with Russia, the amount of fixed asset investment by American companies, in particular in mainland China, over the past 20 years amounts to the trillions of dollars. I mean, it's not worth that. You couldn't liquidate it for that, but in terms of money that has been poured in, as well as some financial investment either in equities or not in Shanghai equities, but in Hong Kong. Has that continued sort of sub rosa beneath these tensions in terms of U.S. companies, U.S. financial institutions continuing to become more integrated or embedded in both mainland China economies and within Hong Kong? Or has that also really post-2017, where there was a somewhat, I mean, it's attached to Trump, but it was largely a bipartisan American consensus that sort of further economic integration with China should reverse?
Well, actually, I mean, there's a very good question. I mean, if you look at the numbers, notwithstanding all the saber rattling amongst the political classes, the reality is that private enterprise and private investors have just been getting on with business. So the volumes of investment have continued to grow. I was myself directly involved with some of the initiatives that enabled that. Not only do the West now have a significant stake in China through foreign direct investment, they now have a massive stake in China through investment in China's securities markets. There's, as best as I can estimate, around about $2 trillion of foreign investment in Chinese securities markets now. What that now means, of course, is that the West has massive interest in China's economic and social well-being. And China has a massive interest in the economic and social well-being of the West, and particularly America. It's very unlike, I hear this new Cold War narrative, and that's a narrative which I think is at best a bit stupid, at worst, frankly, pretty dangerous, because there was no financial or trade or commercial interaction to speak of between the United States and the Soviet Union at the outset of the Cold War in the last century. Today, China and the United States and the West are intricately intertwined through the channels of commerce, through the channels of investment. If they were to disengage or decouple, all you would do is shrink the pie. you can level many, many criticisms at globalization and the displacement that that's caused. And certainly there is huge room for that pie to be better distributed. I think that would go some way towards lessening many of the social tensions and frictions that we see in both China and America and between the two countries. But shrinking the pie through decoupling and shrinking the pie, meaning that there's less to go around overall, at least in my way of reckoning, would simply far worsen the tensions that already exist.
So how do you account for that? Because I've been a little bit head scratching, and for those who don't know, I mean, I've written quite a bit. I did a piece last year saying there's no Cold War with China for foreign policy. I didn't write the headline. No one ever writes your own headline, but it was a good headline. And it is perplexingly discordant, the degree to which these realities continue, meaning foreign investment by American financial institutions, investment funds, businesses in China, the amount of Chinese continual purchases of American treasuries and securities, albeit at a somewhat lower level, but it's hardly stopped. I mean, they remain a substantial buyer. And, you know, cross-border cash and finance flows through Hong Kong, as you pointed out, last year was a massive year for derivatives trading and others. So how do you account for this kind of almost two parallel narratives that tell completely different stories? I mean, it's as if they don't fully interact with one another. There's this political narrative that suits both an American national security establishment and a Chinese national security establishment. I mean, there are the Cold War, both rhetoric and reality, does support a lot of embedded structures within both countries, and each is well cast as an adversary for the other. You know, they're both states, they have different views, they have different mores. And yet you have this sort of ongoing, even with COVID, reality that you talk about. I'm just curious, given that you clearly have thought deeply about a lot of these things, what you think. I mean, it's hard to find a contemporary or example, except potentially European nations prior to World War I. A terrible, terrible analogy, I recognize, given what it leads to, that have been simultaneously increasingly adversarial and increasingly intertwined.
Look, I think that they've clearly been through globalization and other developments, particularly the incremental move forward of technology. There have been many people who have been displaced. I will say that there are obviously many, many dimensions to these great power relations, and I don't claim for one moment to be able to speak to all of them. But I can speak to the financial dimensions of that relationship, and I think the financial dimensions are extremely important because they ultimately drive the distribution of resources in both societies. And what you've seen, and you referred to the events that led up to the First World War. Well, at that time, if you recall, it was the time of the Belle Epoque in Europe. It was the time that you may better know here in the United States as the era of the robber barons. There was massive wealth and income inequality that drove social tensions. Through that period, we saw 2 world wars. Free market ideology, which has pervaded since the 1980s in many countries, including the United States, has been very successful at growing economies, but free markets don't necessarily distribute resources based on merit. And what we've seen is, with that, we've seen a gradual increase in wealth and income disparities. And we've seen time and again throughout history, this is not even just back to the First World War. I mean, every change of Chinese dynasty can be associated with wealth and income disparity, and looking at the ratio at that time, of the arable land available per head of population. So we've seen this time and again, when you allow these disparities to arise and become extreme, social tensions inevitably are the result. And what you've seen, unfortunately, is that rather than addressing the root causes of those problems, leaders in both countries have tended to resort to the simplistic rhetoric of populist nationalism, which unfortunately has simply escalated the tensions between them. And what I fear is that inevitably things go wrong, accidents happen. There are many points of tension between the countries, and if you allow those tensions to be escalated in those ways, it removes the ability for leaders to de-escalate when things go wrong. And I think that that is unfortunately where we've landed now.
So if we flash forward 5 years without demanding certain predictions, the old trope of it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. Where are we in terms of the financial system? And will China have erected a parallel or alternate to SWIFT, SWIFT being the global payment system that is dollar denominated? Will it have found a way of creating a block of interested nations? Maybe that includes India, Brazil, Indonesia, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, Russia, in whatever incarnation. I mean, we may be making the Putin regime persona non grata for all sorts of good reasons, but Russia's going to be there as an energy and agricultural power in 5 years, and 10 years, and 15 years. Or are we going to be in some strange muddle that's an extension of our present? I'm thinking more in terms of the financial aspect of things, rather than, I'm not asking you to make global geopolitical predictions.
Well, look, I mean, the honest truth is that it's entirely unpredictable, and I don't think I have a better guess than anyone sitting in the room. What transpires between the two countries really depends on a lot of individual small decisions taken by leaders on both sides. But you asked about the financial system. Well, China feels insecurity today. It's looking at ways of reducing its dependencies, whether it's through setting up alternative payments networks to SWIFT, pursuing things like its central bank digital currency. I don't know whether those will be entirely successful. There's also this narrative about China having this grand plan for the renminbi to usurp the US dollar as the premier global reserve currency. Well, if there's a plan, I certainly haven't spoken to anyone who knows about it. It's a bit of a sausage-making process, and in fact, my own interactions with Chinese policymakers suggest that actually they're very wary about allowing the renminbi to rise up and take on the kind of role that the dollar has played as a global utility, simply because they've looked at the massive costs that the US has borne for allowing its currency to serve in that role. So they've taken a very slow, very wary approach towards renminbi internationalization. And in fact, if you remember back in 2009, then governor of the PBOC, Zhou Xiaochuan, advocated not for renminbi to take a greater role as a global reserve currency, but for the IMF's special drawing rights, a neutral unit, not controlled by any one country, to serve in that role. That was a position that was repeated by his successor Yi Gang in the middle of 2020 in a Financial Times op-ed article. It's not China's first choice to internationalize the renminbi. If they're forced and have no other better option, they will have to do that. But if you think about this, the dollar system has already gone through a number of what you might call tipping points that could have led to its demise, whether it's in terms of the level of the US's public debt, whether it's in terms of the massive monetary expansion that you've seen, or whether it's in terms of abuse of its dominance of the dollar and the dollar system to weaponize that against its strategic rivals. The history of monetary systems and reserve currencies and fiat currencies is that they inevitably demise at some point. And I think that at this juncture, the United States has the opportunity to take a leading and proactive role in redesigning the system to create a neutral environment in which the global financial highways are safe for all countries to travel on. And I would simply ask US policymakers in particular to think about, if they don't do that and the dollar system has its sunset and another country's currency takes over the dollar, giving that country the same power that the United States now enjoys over others, how will they feel? I think that it would be an act of enlightened self-interest to take a proactive move now to start the process of reforming that system.
So I want to ask one more question that sort of is an enhancement of that, and then we will turn to all of you for the continuing the conversation. If you were called in to talk to the U.S. national security establishment, whatever iteration there was, the National Security Council, the White House, if you were called into Hong Kong and economic authorities and the government of Hong Kong to do the same, and if you were asked by Beijing to do the same, in the spirit of the idea of a Cold War is so punitively harmful to both societies, and the rhetoric is certainly not helpful, that the interdependence that you've talked about is there, that there's this immense potential of tens of trillions of dollars of potential Chinese investment that could go outward to mutually benefit both the return for Chinese investors and individual citizens and for capital needs of multiple countries, including the United States. What would you advise each if you had like a bullet point moment to say in the spirit of more concord and less discord, what would you say to each?
Well, to the United States, I would say that the government needs to get its house in order and solve many of the domestic problems that it's got. That the level of wealth and income disparity in the United States is seriously undermining the United States as a society, and that has significant dangers for the rest of the world. I would also ask them to begin the process of looking at a replacement for the dollar-based global monetary systems. To policymakers in Beijing, I would say that, look, China is now, notwithstanding per capita GDP still being far below the United States and other developed countries, it is the second largest economy in the world. I don't perceive flying in even to a second or third tier Chinese city's airport that China is third world or even second world today, certainly compared to flying from Logan into LaGuardia here. So I think that China does need to take greater responsibility in the global system, that the global system certainly needs to adapt to China's interests and China's needs. Those need to be taken into account alongside those of other countries that had a hand in designing that system. And to Hong Kong, I would say that I think the most important thing is that it needs to, if it's going to continue to serve as an intermediary between China and the international community, then it needs to get its own house in order. It needs to address the livelihood issues that plague the lives of young people, the runaway cost of housing, the very inegalitarian access to education and opportunity. And it also needs to pivot in the past, or at least for the past 30 years, Hong Kong's primary focus has been helping international investors get money into China. China's now very rich. The role needs to shift to help China find ways of getting its investment, its savings out into the international markets.
That was very well put. You should do this for a living. So we have about 10 minutes for questions. I unfortunately have a bit of an unusual hard stop. I'm a bit of a fill-in. I was not originally scheduled to this, and I have my son's birthday dinner, which is nearby. So if I sneak out, it's only because of that, not because I have any lack of desire to speak to all of you. So please, the microphone's there. I think you have to go up because we're also doing this simultaneously online. So as awkward as that is, thank you for being the first.
So one question about you were talking about the sanctions economically with Russia and the pros and cons of that. How do you see that as enough of a deterrence to the Chinese in regards to Taiwan? And is the kind of U.S. prepared beyond sanctions? But I think economically speaking, at least, do you think it's enough of a deterrent?
I'm no expert on Taiwan, and it is far above my level of competence to speak to what Chinese policy is.
I don't know. A minute ago, you were talking to the U.S. president, so I think you're...
Look, I think... I don't think that there is a natural read across from what's happening in Ukraine to Taiwan. I think Chinese policymakers will certainly be paying attention, though, to the means of affecting those sanctions on Russia, because it does feel an incredible amount of vulnerability. As far as Taiwan is concerned, I think we've been left with this kind of historical status quo at the moment, and I would probably take a leaf out of Deng Xiaoping's book and leave that issue for later and hopefully much wiser generations to deal with.
Other questions, someone? And if someone really doesn't want to get up at the end, you can just say it from the seat and I'll repeat it. But thank you for standing.
Yes. Thank you so much for coming to talk to us today. I learned a lot through this conversation. Recently, there's been a pullback of Chinese companies into IPOing and listing in the U.S. capital markets. And there's been a bit of policy change. There's been loosening up more recently. I was just wondering if you could provide more clarity into what the future of Chinese companies listing in the U.S. might look like.
Chinese companies coming to list offshore was always something that was extremely unnatural. No major economy has its largest companies going and listing in other jurisdictions and ceding, therefore, that regulatory influence over them. The circumstances that led to that were that China in the early 90s, when this process all started, was extremely short of capital. Its own domestic capital markets were very underdeveloped, and there was still both a huge degree of internal disagreements amongst Chinese society and Chinese policymakers about the amount of the role that capital markets would play in China. I'd say that Chinese companies returning home to China is probably the natural state of affairs. I would say that it's not necessarily what individual Chinese businessmen and entrepreneurs want to do. China's still got some level of capital controls. If they come and list out in international markets, it means that they're freer to pursue whatever they want to pursue with the capital that they raise. That's more difficult if they list it in the domestic market. But I would say that China's domestic capital markets have made leap and bounds improvements. And I think that eventually, notwithstanding what happens with the issue over audit papers and other access, I think that we're going to see more Chinese, or most Chinese companies choosing to list back at home.
And will home mean in Hong Kong, or will it mean in Shanghai or Shenzhen?
I think that it'll tend to mean Shanghai and Shenzhen more. I mean, even if they come out to Hong Kong, if you think about the narrative around common prosperity, this is about redistribution. This is about levying higher taxes on the wealthiest in Chinese society. Allowing China doesn't have the ability to impose FATCA on the rest of the world. So giving this channel for Chinese entrepreneurs to offshore a part of their wealth where it's very difficult for Chinese authorities to track it for anti-tax avoidance and evasion purposes. I think that the prevailing sentiment is that they would prefer to see those listings happen in the domestic capital markets.
Please.
Thank you. I'm going to take off my mask for a second. To me, the ripple effects of this latest outbreak of COVID, the Omicron, thing, has been disastrous in their ripple effects on the Chinese economy. And I wondered if we could talk about two aspects of those ripple effects. The first one is, a few months ago, I think most of us would have thought that there would be no opposition to Xi in the National Party Congress coming up this fall. And the whole nationalist narrative, which was true at one point in time, has been discredited, that China has survived the last three global crises better than any other country, whether you go back to the global financial crisis, the Asian financial crisis, or the COVID crisis. To what extent do you think that what kind of probability would you put on more and more Communist Party officials saying Xi Jinping has not handled this well, the ripple effects are so profound, and that there will be opposition to him come the fall? Question one. Question two is on the economic effects. We've seen the renminbi depreciate drastically. There is a lot of concern about capital flight from China as the renminbi weakens. I'm a permanent resident of Hong Kong, as I assume many people are in this room. I'm being told you should sell your Hong Kong dollars, put it in US dollars, and get your money out of Hong Kong. To what extent do you think these fears about capital flight are justified? Thank you.
You don't ever ask any easy questions, do you, Henny? On your first,
Xi Jinping, coming or going?
on your first question, this is a very dynamic issue, and I wouldn't begin to hazard a guess as to how it might develop. I think, unfortunately, if you look at the facts, though, it's very difficult for China to pursue a different course at this point in time. And in making that statement, I'm looking at Hong Kong. Hong Kong happened to be, I think, the only place in the world where you had the option between the Sino-U.S. vaccine and the mRNA vaccine. Unfortunately, we've been through a tough time in Hong Kong where we had some of the highest death rates in the world from the latest COVID outbreak there. And during that time, Hong Kong U put out a study on the vaccine efficacy. I mean, obviously, hospitalization rates amongst the unvaccinated were extremely high. But of those who'd been fully vaccinated and had to be hospitalized, 87% of them had taken the Sinovac vaccine. And so China is vulnerable. And what's more, it's not like New York City here where you have a doctor on every street corner. China has 2 doctors per 1,000 head of population. It's an extremely dense population. And you can see very easily that the system could quite easily be overwhelmed if you have a very large outbreak. And so, I don't envy the Chinese government at this point in time because they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Certainly the very tight lockdown restrictions that have been put on cities like Xi'an and Shanghai have been extremely unpopular. But I mean, I just don't know what the result would be if they loosened up. To your second question around the risk of capital flight, I'm incredibly proud about what Hong Kong Exchange did over the last 10 years in playing a major role in China's capital markets internationalization. But that's obviously created significant new dynamics. If you recall back to the late 1990s, the Asian financial crisis, China glided through largely because its capital markets were not integrated with the rest of the world. All foreign investment in China was through FDI, and just because the markets are tanking doesn't mean that Volkswagen's going to yank their plant out. That was largely the case as well in 2008. If you look over the last 10 years, the amount of foreign liquid securities investment in China's domestic markets as a percentage of their foreign exchange reserves in 2011 was 14%. That figure is now approaching or has exceeded 60%, which means that China no longer really has a closed capital account. It has, depending on whether you're a glass half full or half empty sort of a person, it has a semi-open or semi-closed capital account. And so China is going to have to deal with, I think, new challenges brought on by its integration into international financial markets. And I think that given the divergence in monetary policies between the United States and China that's now taking place, we're going to see a significant test of that.
I want to thank you. We are at the end, but there will be a reception, and I'm sorry. I want to thank you for the conversation. It was really illuminating for me, often quite wise. It may just be that you have this mellifluous, measured voice that makes everything seem somewhat agreeable and calm, but nonetheless, I'm feeling very better about a lot of things that I tend to feel worse about, so that's leaving me in a good mood. Thank you all for coming out on this drizzly night for this conversation.
Thank you, Zachary. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.